Hello and welcome. I hope you've had a good weekend. This little live stream, I think it is a podcast episode. I will put it amidst the other podcast episodes, just a way to categorize it, because I did promise that not only would the channel reflect some different strands of our lives, but also that I would create podcasts around those particular strands. By strands, again, you may get tired of me saying this. I hope not. I think it's a useful reminder. However, let me know. So it is about self-leadership, avoiding traps, knowing thyself. It's also about people in positions of influence and authority who are considered to be leaders. And it is ultimately, I suppose, also kind of philosophical in the mix. And what I mean by that is, those bigger questions: why are we here? What is it all about? Where do we go? Where do we come from? That type of thing. And that opens itself up into many different areas. And so today, this one's a little bit more philosophical. So it's not about politics as such. And is it about self-leadership? To a degree, but only in the sense that it is important to reflect, very important to reflect in terms of our journey through life. And I wished some of the leaders that we see around us would reflect. Maybe they do, but it doesn't always appear to be that obvious. Anyway, so I got thinking, you may have heard of this exercise. I got thinking about this exercise just earlier on today for various reasons. And one of the reasons that I think this exercise can be useful is because it can afford us the time and the mechanism, the framework by which we can reflect on who we are and what we're doing. And that is so important. You see many people out there, do you not, who could be cruelly described as NPC, non-player characters. They just go on and on and on like automatons. And of course, much of the outcomes that we have in life are made up from the habits that we have. And the only way to, well, more or less the only way to change those habits is to be aware of them somehow, by whatever mechanism, and then to endeavour to change them, to stop that automatic thing that we might do happening because we want different outcomes. And so if we don't want to live that sort of life, then we need to, at least from time to time, reflect. We need to pause. We need to slow down. We need to consider. And that means looking at ourselves in sometimes a not necessarily flattering light, because we're all flawed and we all make mistakes. And generally speaking, most of us have felt regret, and most of us have also found ourselves kicking ourselves a little bit. Why did you do that? Why did you say this? And so on. And one of the exercises that can allow us to think about what we're doing right now is the one where you ask yourself, what advice would you give to a younger you? And I do like the exercise, but it can be tinged with poignancy as well. Because if you think about it, generally speaking, as far as I'm aware, we can't do that. We can't go back in time and talk to ourselves. So it can contain a bit of sadness when you think about you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30, whatever. And very often when we consider us then, and it's unlikely to be a fully accurate representation. We have fleeting memories and we can think about who we were right then and pick out bits and pieces. But very often we were naive or more naive. We probably, for many of us, hadn't had some of the harder knocks that inevitably we face. That isn't going to be the case with everyone, of course. So there's that potential sadness to it. Well, what has happened between now and then, or then and now, and was I really even remotely the same person? However, I have said I think it's a good exercise. So, whilst it is unlikely to be physically something we could do, in part because of grandfather paradoxes and all that type of thing, I think it can be a difficult exercise to consider, because not only might we dismiss it in the sense that, well, we can't really do that, so what's the point? But also, if we do imagine talking to that younger version of ourselves, then there is that sense of potentially, depending on who it is, everybody's different, potentially of what might have been. You know, if you did take this advice, if I give myself advice 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever it may be, and then how might my life have been different? Well, that makes sense. But I can't do that, so it isn't going to be. But I don't believe that's really what is at the core of that exercise ultimately, and I'll come on to that. And just in case, the grandfather paradox is this idea that we can't travel backwards in time because we would potentially do something that would impact our future. Then it would be our future if we're back in time, which would mean our future would be different. So maybe we couldn't have gone back because things would be altered. And the ultimate example of that is if we went back in time and did away with our grandfather for whatever weird reason, then we would cease to exist. And if we cease to exist because we wouldn't have been, oh, this is, by the way, before we're born, I should have added that, do away with our grandfather before we're born. So we're never born, so we can't go back in time. Now, some mathematicians, and I think physicists, have said potentially that could be done because they've found loopholes, but this is all theoretical. It's written down. It is essentially a set of equations, or maybe one big equation. But still, even if we could do that, it seems to me, not having gone through the equations, I'm busy, it seems to me that what the future that we would come back to wouldn't be the same one. How could it be? So if we're not born and we go back in time and do away with our grandfather, and we can still come back to present day, then it's going to be a different past we went into, or a different present day we come back to. Anyway, this is a big debate. I don't mean to get sidetracked into that area beyond this recognition that it's unlikely we'd be able to do that. But let's not say impossible, because yes, of course, the whole multiverse idea, that some people believe that is possible, other people challenge it. But once more, it's a different universe. If that exists, it's not the same universe. So we have this continual issue with things splitting, splintering, and not being the same if we could go back. So what have we got so far? We've got probably, if we could go back and then return, we wouldn't be returning to the same future. And if we did go back and change something, we wouldn't be changing it in the same past that we remember. And also, there is this element of sadness about that exercise, for me at least, because I can go back and think, gosh, if I could just give you more confidence, if I could just tell you it's going to be all right, if I could just say, hey, don't worry about it, that stuff doesn't matter. Now, then we begin to get into why this exercise can be useful, because a couple of things. Number one, all the advice that we might be giving ourselves in the past could well still apply. Maybe the detail is different, or maybe we just need a reminder. So if you go back in time and you say to your younger self, look, some people are just idiots, and they don't like difference, or they don't like somebody who maybe threatens them. And they will say things, but they're doing it because of their issues. They're doing it because of their problems. They're doing it because of their lack. They're doing it because of what has happened to them at the hands of other people, whoever that may be. And so we can turn it around to our younger self, but we can also think about that today, can't we? We can say, well, if that's the advice they would give me then, does any of that still apply? And sometimes we can say to ourselves, well, no, because I'm tougher and thicker skinned these days, so it would just bounce off me. Does it though? All the time? Are there situations where maybe we have to remind ourselves about that? And another thing that maybe we'd go back in time and tell our younger self is, do you know what? It doesn't matter that much what people think of you. You may have some key friends, but if they're real friends, they will accept you as you are. And if you do too much to move away from fitting in, if you do too much to move away from who you are because you want to fit in, is a better way to put it, then you're actually not being true to yourself. The interesting thing about that one is if we did go back in time and if this was an issue for our younger selves, then that could be a tough one for our younger self to deal with, because peer pressure and peer groups and being in the in crowd and not in the out crowd can be much more intense and visceral when you're younger. But here's the thing, in case you haven't guessed already where I'm going with that, is that if we say to ourselves now, well, how much are you denying who you actually are? How much are you trying to fit in? How much are you really squashing, repressing something which is really part of you, and therefore you should be able to be yourself. You should be true to who you are. And one could argue that these days that peer pressure is, funnily enough, more intense, even as older versions of ourselves. And what I mean by that is that there are so many trends out there, aren't there? There's so many memes. There's so many. What's the best way to describe it? Like a social wave that seems to come across. This is how we have to be now. This is the end thing now. This is what people who are on trend are saying and doing. And there is this, I think there is quite a strong drive and pull for a lot of people to be involved in that. Now, you may have heard of the FOMO, fear of missing out, in terms of social media. And I thought about that for a while, and I thought, well, I don't really feel I'm missing out on something. That's not really what would compel me to go and interact with people on social media. But then I thought, well, yeah, okay, I am compelled to go and interact if there's friendship, if there's common interests. And part of that could mean that we want to, make a video in the latest style of whatever it may be, if it's TikTok, or comment about this latest issue, if it's X or whatever, and Instagram's in the mix as well, no doubt. And because of the strange social wave, as I call it, this sometimes almost global effect that people need to feel they're involved, and that for me is the real fear of missing out, is fear of not being seen to be on trend, of missing out in the joint and reciprocal kudos that we can receive and transmit if we're actually doing the thing that's hip, or whatever the word would be these days. And so, oddly, that advice to a younger self could in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways be much more of an acute message that we need to hear and act upon now, because the world has changed, of course, over the last few years. The threats and opportunities are different. There are more subtleties to deal with in terms of, just think of how language is changing so quickly. And for example, what you shouldn't say, mustn't say, must say, how we have got to be careful in terms of navigating those social dynamics. And so the exercise I think ultimately about going back and what advice would you give your younger self is much more about us. It's much more about pausing and thinking about our lives right now. And an exercise that I would add on to that is to consider what we actually want to achieve. And this is rather than looking back, which ultimately is, I believe, about thinking right now, present day. So the advice to younger self, yeah, cool, good, good. We can imagine us giving our younger self that advice that might make us feel better, and that's fantastic. But I think it's also about advice for right now. But there's a future, how would I call it? A future based, I don't want to call it exercise, but little mind, a sort of thought exercise. There we go. That's a better way to put it. A future-based thought exercise that you might be interested in as well. So before we do that, to summarize, going back, probably unlikely to go back and then come forward in time again to exactly the same universe or indeed outcomes. Can't quite see how that would be possible, at least based on what we seem to understand right now. Second, it can help us to imagine we're giving ourselves advice and comfort in the past, and that's great. Why not? Absolutely. If that works, do it. You deserve it. And I think it is a lot to do with, if that's the advice you would give your younger self, are you following it right now? Are you actually living in alignment with that advice? And maybe you need to consider it, and consider it in perhaps more subtle ways in terms of how it might apply today. So I think those are a couple of the reasons that exercise is good. But what about this thought exercise going forward? Well, here's the thing. Most of what we do is made up of habits. We don't really think about it. There are neural pathways that there's a trigger, there's something that happens. It could be an event, it could be attending a meeting with certain people, and when we go into this particular mode, it could be someone who phones us and you see the name and you act in a certain way. It can, of course, be as simple as, well, it's not always simple, but driving on the left-hand side of the road as opposed to the right, depending on what your habit is and what country you're in. We don't tend to think about it, we just do it. And so some people say 90% of what we do during any given day, or 99%, is made up of habit. And some people say that, by the way, I don't think that's actually true, but I understand the sentiment. And some people say that we don't have much ability to really make choice because things are habitually driven. I agree on one hand with that, and I disagree on another. I understand the argument that if everything that we've done and all the events around us, those may vary, but our habitual neural pathways, given this set of events, and given our background and our conditioning and our beliefs and our values, when we reach this point in time and space, we'll do it that way. That, I think, is a very strong argument. However, suppose before we get to that point in time and space where, with all this baggage, all this conditioning, all these habits, all these beliefs, all these values, we have little choice but to act or react automatically without really thinking, because all that programming, if we could call it that, leads us to that point and we make that decision, take that action. All right. Okay. But suppose we decide now that we want to improve ourselves. And one of the ways we're going to do that, to pick a strategy, if I could call it that, which most of us have heard of, meditation. So we decide to meditate, and or we decide to visualize different ways of doing things. And Both of those, by the way, are exercises that can be run and carried out on a regular basis. Meditation, to think about what we're thinking about, to spot those thoughts coming in, to become less reactive, to step back from the thought, to consider what we want to do, rather than it's just a reflex, rather than it's just sort of like an instinct. We hear something and toot the horn, or a dog hears something and barks. It's just reflex. So we think about what we're thinking about. And also, we visualize, we imagine, rehearsing in our mind's eye how we're going to act differently next time we're faced with a particular situation. And so I believe that by using those two strategies and using them fairly regularly, we can begin to shift our ability to be more thoughtful in the moment, to put a pause in before we react, to essentially slow things down so we are more considered. And that part is more about the meditation aspect. To see the thought coming in, to look at it, to wonder about that thought and watch it disappear before we do anything. And there is, of course, a question you may be asking there: who's doing the watching? Very good question. Some people call it the observing self. What is that? Who is that? Is that really us? Is that the us, rather than simply the thoughts? Is that our consciousness? Is that the core of it? Is that our energy? And the rest of it, the mechanical, the physical bit, and even the thoughts, are things that this other version of us, this deeper version, is able to watch, to apprehend, to consider. So doing that, observing those thoughts, can slow us down, can help us not to be as reactive. And also, what we can do is to practice mental rehearsal about a particular situation. So normally, let's say, if we go with a theory that we've no choice in the moment, we've no choice, because all that conditioning, those habits, those beliefs will take us to a point where what happens is we'll just do it automatically. We're thrust along. It's almost like being carried by a powerful river, to the point where, wow, when we get to this part of the river, this part of the stream, we've no choice but to be swept along with it in this particular direction, because we've got all the weight of those beliefs and that conditioning behind us. And again, that does make sense. But suppose upstream, we have said, well, hold on, when this particular rock appears in the middle of the river, or this particular formation of rocks, I will be meditating about the thoughts that I have when I consider rocks. And rather than panic, or rather than say, I'm going to paddle left or paddle right, or whatever analogy you want to use, I will just do nothing. I will not struggle, because I believe that the river will take me safely through the middle of those rocks. So we've theoretically, by consciously thinking about what we're thinking before we face that situation again, have changed that potential output in the future, the way that we may potentially act. And additionally, if we are also, let's say, mentally rehearsing from a space of deep relaxation, us in a situation when those rocks appear in the river, and relaxing and allowing ourselves to go through this gap because we believe that the river is safe there. And maybe we've also consulted a few experts and we're pretty sure it is. What I'm not saying here is just imagine that you will be able to miraculously float over the rocks, so they'll turn into papier-mâché as you get close. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what we can do is we can change how we're going to react. And one way to think about that is more of a response. We're responding because we have actually thought about not reacting before we get there, and we've thought about doing something in a different way. So it's more considered. And so for sure, when we get to that point again, we are still being propelled with all the beliefs, with all the values, with all the conditioning, with all the habits that we've had. But in the middle of that is also the little bit of conditioning and visualization that we have done to prepare ourselves to not react in the same way, to essentially give us some energy or momentum in this imagined new version of ourselves or new way of reacting, or I should say responding, then that's in the mix. And so even although we could still argue, when you see the rock, then you're propelled to act automatically. You're propelled. You've no choice. You've no freedom of thought. There is no choice. If that is true, and let's say for a second it is, we've still changed it, because upstream we began to meditate. We began to visualize. And yes, you can get even deeper than that and say, yeah, but what allowed you to think about meditating in the first place? For sure. But this is where I think some of us disagree with people who say we've absolutely no freedom of choice. There is nothing that we can do. We are automatons. It is all predestined. I think a lot of the stuff that we do, as I've said, is automatic, but I also believe that we all, most of us at least, have the capacity, the capability to say, no, there's got to be more to this life than that. I don't believe that this is all robotic. I don't believe that what we're doing is just done without thought. And the fact that we can even think that thought, to me, means that there's some loopholes in the theory of, yeah, we're just compelled to do things. There is no choice. Because what we're doing is we're making the choice by whatever mechanism we read about meditation or somebody told us about it, but our willpower. And we have will, and I believe that we have free will. It's not always accessed, and we don't always use it, but that ability to decide, I'm going to do something differently here. And maybe that decision comes from that observing part of us, the part that observes the thoughts, that deeper part, that other part of our consciousness. And that, I believe, whatever that may be, gives us the ability to say, at this point in time, I'm going to practice doing this. And once more, is there a pressure, like the pressure of the water, from beliefs, from habits, from conditioning? Yes, but I think there's something in there. There's this loophole, there's this ability that well, most of us have, to be able to say, no, in this moment, when I'm reflecting, when I'm considering, when I'm quiet, when I'm still, I want to do things differently. And so we put this extra bit of information into that information flow that is propelling us along. The information, again, just to be clear, of beliefs, of values, of habits. And in the middle of it is this new information about how we can not react to our thoughts. And there is also this new information about a future memory that we have visualized to show us doing something differently. And ultimately, that's what I think the going back in time exercise is useful for. One of the reasons, speaking to our younger self, what advice we can feel confident giving the younger us that advice, make us feel better. So good. And also we can ask ourselves, are we taking that advice now? Maybe the detail has changed. Maybe we have to think more widely, broadly, in a more subtle way to figure out where it might apply, but it probably still does apply. It's why we're thinking about it, to tell our younger self that. Are we doing enough of it? Are we bothering less about people enough? And if we have that ability, then surely we have the ability to future pace ourselves and think about a different version of us. Some people say our ideal self. That's aspirational. It's always going to be work in progress, I would expect, unless we're egomaniacs. If we ever say to ourselves, yeah, I'm ideal, then maybe. But I'm unique and good. I'm good enough to value myself, then that I think should be said, must be said. So to consider being different, how do we want to change? What if we extrapolate, if we look back in time at that younger self, we think of us present day, what can we change now? And using some of that information, those subject areas, how different would we like to be? How far can we take ourselves in terms of being better versions? For me, at least, it's never going to be ideal. But knowing that it's work in progress with that awareness, I think, is something perhaps for all of us to consider, even amidst this busy life. Anyway, oh, hold on. There are messages, I think, and once again, I cannot see them. Let me just no. So yeah, I thought I had fixed that. I did promise last time, and I did set it up to be able to look. So I do apologise, but can't see them. If they're there, if they are there, maybe it's just a glitch in the system. It doesn't seem to be a message. But anyway, if you're watching this live, thank you very much for staying long enough. I hope that made some kind of sense. That in of itself is a bit of a flow of consciousness, but I thought I would share because you never know, somebody somewhere may find it useful. And if you are watching this as a recording, if it does record and the recording is of reasonable quality, I'll leave it up if it is, then I hope you've also found it useful. Anyway, I shall head off to think about my self in the past. What advice do I need to follow now, and what I want to do differently going forward. I hope you find that useful, and thanks again for tuning in. For the moment, from me,